This is a system status broadcast. Engineering assessments conducted over the past several reporting cycles have confirmed widespread structural corrosion across multiple metropolitan and regional areas. The findings indicate visible and progressive material degradation affecting a range of critical infrastructure assets. These include highway and pedestrian bridges, communication and transmission towers, elevated rail supports, port gantries, and other exposed steel frameworks integral to transportation, logistics, and public services. Inspection reports note accelerated corrosion patterns inconsistent with standard age-related wear. In several locations, surface oxidation has progressed beyond protective coatings and into load-bearing components. While no single failure mode has been identified, engineers have emphasized that cumulative degradation may reduce structural tolerances over time if left unmitigated. It is important to note that these assessments do not originate from a single jurisdiction or oversight body. Reports were submitted independently by municipal engineers, private inspection firms, transit authorities, and utility operators. At this time, no consolidated national or interregional advisory has been issued. Coordination efforts are ongoing, but verification and cross-comparison of findings remain incomplete. Authorities have not recommended immediate closures on a broad scale. However, targeted load restrictions, speed reductions, and access limitations have been enacted in select areas as precautionary measures. Additional inspections are being scheduled, though resource availability and weather conditions may affect timelines. In parallel with infrastructure concerns, municipal water systems in several regions have been declared unsafe for consumption without treatment. Routine monitoring has identified rapid pH collapse in reservoirs, treatment basins, and collection tanks. The rate of change observed exceeds standard adjustment capacities in some facilities. As a result, conventional boil advisories are no longer considered sufficient in affected zones. While boiling remains effective against biological contaminants, it does not address chemical instability or corrosive water conditions. Officials have advised that untreated consumption may pose risks to plumbing systems and, in some cases, human health. At this stage, no unified replacement guidance has been finalized. Local authorities are issuing interim instructions based on available treatment options, including filtration, neutralization agents, or temporary water distribution. Public health agencies are continuing to evaluate exposure thresholds, though confirmed impact data remains limited. Residents in affected areas are advised to follow local directives as they are released and to monitor official channels for updates. Distribution points for treated water may be established with limited notice. Industrial and medical facilities have been instructed to review contingency protocols. The absence of a consolidated advisory reflects the evolving nature of the situation rather than a determination of stability. Data collection is ongoing, and additional assessments are expected as more regions complete inspections and laboratory analysis. At this time, authorities emphasize that the situation remains under review. Further updates will be issued as information is verified and guidance is standardized. This concludes the current systems status broadcast. Field engineering teams have reported accelerated material decay following extended periods of rainfall across multiple inspection zones. The precipitation events were not extreme by historical standards. However, the duration and persistence appear to have contributed to abnormal exposure conditions. Moisture retention was observed on structural surfaces well beyond typical drying intervals, particularly on shaded and enclosed components. Protective coatings were present on some structures and absent on others, reflecting variations in maintenance schedules, construction eras, and jurisdictional standards. Notably, The presence of coatings did not consistently correlate with reduced degradation. In several locations, corrosion was observed beneath intact surface treatments, while adjacent uncoated elements exhibited slower visible decay. Corrosion patterns appeared inconsistent even between neighboring structures constructed with similar materials and subjected to comparable environmental conditions. Engineers reported irregular progression rates, with some components showing advanced deterioration, while adjacent members remained largely unaffected. As a result, no uniform failure model has been identified at this time. Inspection teams documented multiple indicators of structural compromise. These included surface flaking, joint weakening, and discoloration affecting load-bearing elements. In several instances, corrosion was identified on components specifically rated for extended outdoor exposure and designed to withstand prolonged contact with moisture. The findings suggest performance outcomes outside expected parameters. All inspections were formally logged according to standard reporting protocols. Photographic evidence, material samples, and stress observations were collected where feasible. The compiled findings were forwarded to supervising agencies and infrastructure owners for review. At this time, no corrective timelines have been issued, and no standardized remediation strategy has been announced. Separately, water treatment facilities in multiple regions have reported abnormal chemical readings during routine operations. Monitoring systems detected pH levels declining at rates exceeding forecast models during standard testing cycles. These changes were observed across different facility types, including surface reservoirs, underground storage tanks, and active treatment basins. Automatic correction systems were triggered in response to the readings. These systems functioned as designed, deploying buffering agents and initiating stabilization sequences. Despite these interventions, pH stabilization was not achieved within expected operational windows. In several cases, corrective cycles repeated without producing sustained improvement. Facility operators have documented the events and escalated reports to regional water authorities. Additional sampling and laboratory analysis are underway to determine contributing factors. Until further guidance is issued, affected systems remain under observation, and interim measures continue on a localized basis. The situation remains under active assessment. Further updates will be provided as verified information becomes available. Maintenance protocols were reviewed by relevant agencies following receipt of the latest inspection data. In most cases, existing procedures remained unchanged. Officials noted that current maintenance frameworks were designed around standard degradation models and did not automatically trigger escalation under the conditions observed. As a result, routine inspection intervals, coding schedules, and monitoring thresholds largely remained in place pending further analysis. Temporary reinforcements were authorized in a limited number of zones identified as higher risk. These measures included supplemental bracing, localized load redistribution, and short-term material stabilization intended to reduce stress on affected components. The authorizations did not extend to full structural replacement or major reconstruction. Officials emphasized that these actions were precautionary and intended to maintain service continuity rather than resolve underlying degradation. Traffic restrictions were discussed among transportation authorities as a potential risk mitigation measure. Considerations included weight limits, speed reductions, and selective access controls. Implementation, however, was not uniform. Some jurisdictions enacted restrictions immediately, while others deferred action pending additional verification. In several regions, no changes were made, citing insufficient evidence to justify disruption. Water advisories were updated incrementally as new data became available. Public notices referenced precautionary measures, including avoidance of untreated consumption and the use of approved filtration where available. Messaging focused on interim risk reduction rather than long-term safety assurances. No definitive safety thresholds were communicated, and officials acknowledged that guidance may continue to evolve as monitoring continues. Requests for intercity coordination were submitted through established regional and national channels. These requests sought data sharing, joint assessment frameworks, and alignment of public guidance. Responses varied by jurisdiction. Some agencies acknowledged receipt and initiated limited coordination efforts, while others cited resource constraints or ongoing internal reviews. Several requests remain pending without formal response. At this time, authorities continue to emphasize situational monitoring and information gathering. No unified operational posture has been adopted. Further updates will be issued as coordination efforts progress and assessments are consolidated. Transportation authorities across multiple jurisdictions have implemented adjustments to load tolerances on portions of the active network. Weight limits for freight, maintenance vehicles, and public transit were recalculated using revised safety margins derived from recent inspection data. These recalculations were applied selectively, reflecting localized assessments rather than system-wide determinations. In several regions, updated weight limits were approved internally but not immediately communicated to the public. Required signage changes were delayed due to procurement timelines, jurisdictional review processes, and coordination gaps between transportation agencies and municipal departments. As a result, some routes currently operate under revised tolerances that are not visibly posted on site. Despite these adjustments, most transportation corridors remain operational. Traffic flow continues under modified parameters where applied, though enforcement varies by region. Officials have stated that recalculated tolerances are intended as interim measures and do not represent long-term stabilization. Communication infrastructure remains active. Towers and relay structures continue operating at their rated capacities. Signal quality has remained within expected performance ranges, and no widespread transmission degradation has been reported. Structural assessments of these installations did not trigger automatic shutdown protocols. Monitoring continues, but operational status has not changed. Water distribution networks have also remained active. Flow rates have been maintained across municipal and regional systems, with operators prioritizing continuity of service. Secondary containment options, including sectional isolation and temporary bypass routing, were reviewed by utilities and regulators. These options were not deployed, pending further assessment of system-wide impact. Independent laboratories have confirmed abnormal acidity levels in multiple reservoirs and collection facilities. The results were logged through established reporting channels and shared with oversight bodies. Interpretation of these findings has been deferred, citing the need for additional sampling, comparative analysis, and validation against historical baselines. One confirmation has been formally recorded and disseminated among engineering teams. No inspected structure returned to a pre-rainfall corrosion state following initial exposure. Subsequent rainfall was recorded in several affected areas, extending exposure duration. Moisture persistence has been identified as a contributing factor to ongoing material degradation. Engineering follow-up inspections conducted after the additional rainfall noted progression rather than stabilization. Corrosion advanced along previously identified stress points, including joints, fasteners, and load transfer interfaces. In several cases, deterioration followed existing microfractures or areas of known fatigue. New sites exhibiting similar indicators were added to inspection lists, expanding the scope of monitoring activity. Water treatment facilities responded to ongoing chemical instability by increasing dosing of corrective agents. These adjustments reduced short-term variability in readings, but did not restore baseline values. Operators reported diminished responsiveness of buffering systems under sustained conditions. Boil advisories remained active where previously issued. Alternative public guidance was discussed, but not finalized. Oversight committees at municipal, regional, and federal levels reviewed summary reports compiled from engineering and water quality data. Raw data sets were not redistributed beyond originating agencies. No emergency classification was applied following these reviews. Responsibility for structural safety and water quality oversight remains divided among multiple entities. No single authority issued binding directives. Infrastructure operators formally requested clarification regarding liability thresholds under the evolving conditions. Responses acknowledged receipt, but referenced ongoing assessment processes. No definitive guidance was provided regarding responsibility allocation should further degradation or service disruption occur. Water utilities submitted requests for authorization to initiate controlled system shutdowns in select areas. These requests were evaluated, but approval was deferred pending additional review. Regulators cited the need to balance precautionary action with continuity of essential services. Public messaging released during this period emphasized continued monitoring and the issuance of updates as information becomes available. Advisories did not include expiration dates. Officials stated that timelines would depend on validation of revised thresholds and the outcome of ongoing assessments. At least 12 structures previously categorized under routine inspection schedules were removed from that classification and reassigned to continuous monitoring. This shift reflects recognition of accelerated degradation, but does not constitute closure or decommissioning. Despite confirmed material decay, associated transit routes remain operational. Despite confirmed water contamination, distribution continues under advisory conditions. Automated monitoring systems across infrastructure and water treatment facilities logged new data points throughout the reporting period. Internal alerts were generated in response to threshold deviations. Escalation criteria, as currently defined, were not met. As a result, automated emergency responses were not activated. Temporary measures continued to accumulate. These include localized reinforcements, operational adjustments, chemical dosing increases, and monitoring expansions. Permanent solutions, including structural replacement, system redesign, or long-term chemical stabilization strategies, were not scheduled. No system has reverted to an earlier operational state. Engineering reviews remain active. Water quality assessments continue. Structural integrity has not been restored. Chemical balance has not stabilized. Authorities emphasize that the absence of escalation does not indicate resolution. It reflects adherence to existing criteria under conditions that remain under evaluation. Further updates will be issued when validation thresholds are revised or when consolidated guidance is authorized. This broadcast does not indicate resolution. It confirms continuation. This concludes the current systems status broadcast. Agricultural monitoring agencies have confirmed that crop losses in multiple regions have reached an irreversible threshold. Field assessments conducted over successive reporting periods indicate that recovery has not occurred within expected biological cycles. These findings apply across a range of crop types and geographic zones, particularly those subjected to repeated and prolonged precipitation events. Crop failure has been confirmed through direct observation, yield sampling, and satellite analysis. In affected regions, plant recovery has not been observed following standard dormancy and regrowth intervals. Replanting efforts were initiated in limited areas. However, outcomes did not meet viability benchmarks. As a result, broader replanting strategies remain under review pending further evaluation of soil and environmental conditions. Field reports consistently document widespread crop degradation. Root systems exhibit structural breakdown, including reduced tensile integrity and diminished anchoring capacity. In multiple samples, root tissue showed signs of saturation-related collapse and compromised nutrient transport. These indicators were present even in crops previously classified as resilient under high moisture conditions. Above-ground plant structures also display abnormal characteristics. Leaf tissue shows surface damage inconsistent with seasonal patterns, including irregular thinning, discoloration, and premature necrosis. Agronomists report that these symptoms do not align with known pest cycles or typical nutrient deficiencies. Laboratory analysis is ongoing, but no unifying causal agent has been confirmed. Soil conditions have deteriorated in parallel. Soil buffering capacity has declined across monitored plots, reducing resistance to chemical and pH fluctuations. In several regions, saturation levels remained elevated for extended periods, limiting oxygen availability and disrupting microbial balance. These conditions have persisted beyond corrective thresholds typically achieved through drainage or soil amendment. Harvest projections were revised downward as a result of these findings. Initial revisions were issued following early field losses, with subsequent revisions repeating across multiple reporting cycles. Each revision incorporated updated data, yet no recovery indicators were validated. Yield expectations remain below minimum sustainable levels in several agricultural zones. At least 3 consecutive growth cycles failed to reach maturity in multiple regions. This pattern has been confirmed through planting records, field inspections, and harvest data. Officials note that repeated cycle failure significantly reduces the probability of near-term recovery, even under improved conditions. Long-term productivity assessments are underway. Seed reserves were assessed in response to these developments. Inventory reviews identified available stockpiles and potential redistribution pathways. Distribution plans were drafted to support future planting windows. Implementation, however, remains pending due to uncertainty regarding environmental suitability and soil stabilization timelines. Parallel to agricultural impacts, material protection systems continue to show declining performance. Protective coatings and sealants designed for chemical resistance are proving ineffective under current exposure conditions. These materials, previously rated for extended durability, are exhibiting early-stage failure well ahead of projected lifespans. Material degradation has been documented across multiple applications, including agricultural equipment, storage facilities, and infrastructure adjacent to cultivation areas. Reapplication schedules were revised in response to observed failures, with increased frequency and modified formulations. Effectiveness has not improved following these adjustments. Testing indicates that degradation is occurring beneath intact surface layers, suggesting penetration or bypass of protective barriers. Engineers report that failure modes vary between sites, complicating predictive modeling and mitigation planning. No revised coating standard has yet demonstrated sustained performance. Power infrastructure continues operating in a degraded mode. Substations, transmission lines, and associated support structures show accelerated corrosion consistent with earlier infrastructure assessments. While power delivery remains stable in most regions, inspection data indicate narrowing safety margins. Maintenance response teams remain active. Targeted interventions, including localized repairs and component reinforcement, have been deployed where feasible. These actions are intended to preserve operational continuity rather than restore full design capacity. Maintenance efforts remain incomplete due to scope, resource limitations, and ongoing exposure conditions. Operators report that some components now require continuous monitoring rather than periodic inspection. Automated systems track temperature, load, and material condition, generating internal alerts when thresholds are approached. Escalation criteria have not yet been revised to reflect the observed degradation patterns. Agricultural processing and storage facilities have also reported secondary impacts. Moisture infiltration, material corrosion, and reduced equipment reliability have been noted in facilities serving affected regions. While operations continue, contingency planning has been initiated in anticipation of reduced throughput. Interagency coordination remains active but fragmented. Agricultural authorities, environmental agencies, and infrastructure operators continue to exchange summary findings. Data integration efforts are ongoing. No consolidated directive has been issued regarding recovery timelines or large-scale intervention. Public advisories related to agricultural supply emphasize monitoring and assessment. Officials have acknowledged reduced output projections and potential downstream effects, but have not issued definitive forecasts. Messaging continues to reference evolving conditions rather than resolution. Economic impact assessments are in progress. Preliminary models indicate sustained losses extending beyond the current season. These assessments have not yet been finalized or released for policy action. The cumulative findings indicate that current conditions exceed standard variability assumptions built into agricultural planning models. Repeated precipitation exposure, reduced soil buffering, and material protection failures collectively limit recovery potential within established cycles. This broadcast confirms continuation, not resolution. Agricultural losses remain in effect. Infrastructure degradation persists. Protective measures have not regained effectiveness. Further updates will be issued as validation thresholds are revised and additional data is confirmed. Protective coatings applied to agricultural equipment have shown premature breakdown across multiple regions. Field inspections and maintenance records indicate that coatings designed to resist prolonged chemical exposure are failing earlier than projected under standard use conditions. Surface degradation has been observed on harvesting machinery, irrigation systems, storage conveyors, and transport equipment operating in high moisture environments. Sealants rated for extended chemical and environmental exposure have lost adhesion in multiple applications. In affected equipment, seal failure has allowed moisture ingress at joints, fasteners, and interface points. Once adhesion was compromised, deterioration progressed rapidly along exposed seams and contact surfaces. Maintenance logs confirm that failure timelines shortened following repeated precipitation events, even where equipment was maintained within recommended operating parameters. In several cases, coating loss occurred without visible mechanical damage. Surface layers detached cleanly from underlying substrates, suggesting chemical or environmental interaction rather than abrasion. Reapplication efforts were undertaken using the same materials and, in some cases, alternative formulations. Subsequent inspections showed no meaningful improvement in service life. Similar degradation patterns have been documented on infrastructure coatings applied to agricultural storage facilities. Silos, warehouses, cold storage units, and processing buildings exhibited uneven rates of coating failure. Adjacent structures, often constructed during the same period, and exposed to comparable conditions, displayed markedly different levels of resistance. Engineers reported that some coated surfaces retained partial integrity, while neighboring panels showed advanced degradation. This variability has complicated predictive maintenance planning. No consistent durability pattern has been confirmed that would allow reliable prioritization based solely on material type, age, or exposure classification. Manufacturers were notified of the observed performance discrepancies. Material specifications were reviewed internally, and reclassification requests were submitted for several coating and sealant systems. These requests seek reassessment of environmental tolerance ratings and service life projections. As of this reporting period, updated standards have not been issued. Testing conducted by independent laboratories and manufacturer-affiliated facilities has not identified a coating system that demonstrates sustained resistance beyond initial exposure windows under current conditions. Performance degradation appears to accelerate after repeated wetting cycles, regardless of stated chemical resistance properties. Parallel degradation has been documented in electrical infrastructure. Electrical substations reported surface corrosion on housings, enclosures, and external connectors. While corrosion initially appeared cosmetic, follow-up inspections identified material thinning and contact degradation at multiple connection points. Transmission lines showed accelerated wear at junctions, clamps, and suspension assemblies. These areas, subject to combined mechanical stress and environmental exposure, exhibited corrosion rates exceeding historical averages. Insulation integrity declined in several installations, prompting localized monitoring and interim mitigation measures. Despite these findings, substations and transmission corridors remain operational. Power delivery has been maintained through continuous adjustment rather than restoration. Operators emphasize that systems are functioning within revised parameters rather than original design specifications. Maintenance crews have rotated continuously in response to expanding inspection and repair demands. Work schedules were adjusted to maintain coverage across critical assets. Despite these efforts, repair backlogs have expanded. Components requiring attention now exceed available maintenance windows in several regions. Prioritization protocols were revised to focus on assets supporting essential services. Less critical repairs were deferred. This redistribution of effort has stabilized immediate risk, but has not reduced overall degradation trends. Grid operators adjusted load balancing protocols to accommodate reduced tolerance margins. Power flows were redistributed across available pathways to limit stress on compromised components. As part of this process, non-essential redundancy was reduced to preserve capacity for critical operations. Outage thresholds were recalculated using updated degradation data. These thresholds now reflect lower failure margins and reduced buffer capacity. Operators report that while recalibration improves short-term reliability, it narrows the range for corrective action should conditions worsen. No grid sector has returned to baseline operating condition following intervention. Each adjustment has mitigated specific vulnerabilities without reversing underlying material decline. Continuous monitoring remains in effect across transmission, distribution, and substation assets. Agricultural operations dependent on electrical infrastructure have reported secondary impacts. Intermittent power quality fluctuations, reduced tolerance for peak demand, and maintenance-related interruptions have been documented. While outages remain limited, operational flexibility has decreased. Coordination between agricultural operators, infrastructure managers, and manufacturers continues. Summary findings are exchanged through established channels. However, no consolidated remediation framework has been adopted. Temporary measures have accumulated across sectors. These include repeated reapplication of coatings, localized equipment replacement, expanded inspection schedules, and operational adjustments. Permanent solutions, such as redesigned materials, revised standards, or large-scale replacement programs, have not been scheduled. Authorities emphasize that current operations represent managed degradation rather than recovery. Systems remain functional, but performance margins continue to narrow. No coating system has demonstrated sustained resistance beyond initial exposure windows. No electrical sector has returned to baseline condition after intervention. Maintenance activity remains continuous. Repair backlogs persist. Engineering reviews remain active. Material assessments continue. Operational adjustments are ongoing. Further updates will be issued as validation thresholds are revised or new standards are authorized. Health agencies across multiple jurisdictions have issued updated exposure advisories following continued monitoring of environmental conditions. Based on current assessments, outdoor movement has been restricted to emergency activity only in designated areas. These restrictions were issued as precautionary measures in response to observed exposure effects rather than a confirmed stabilization of conditions. Protective clothing has been recommended for individuals required to operate outdoors. Approved garments include full coverage outer layers, gloves, eye protection, and respiratory barriers where applicable. Field evaluations indicate that protective clothing reduces exposure intensity, but does not eliminate it. Penetration through seams, interfaces, and uncovered areas has been documented, particularly during extended exposure intervals. Compliance with the advisories has varied by region. Some jurisdictions reported high adherence, supported by coordinated public messaging and employer enforcement. Other regions reported inconsistent compliance, citing economic necessity, logistical constraints, or limited access to protective equipment. Enforcement guidance issued by authorities remained advisory in nature. No uniform penalty framework was adopted. Medical reports submitted during this period indicate an increase in skin and eye irritation following relatively short exposure intervals. Symptoms include surface inflammation, dryness, burning sensation, and visual discomfort. In most cases, symptoms were reported after exposure durations previously considered low risk. Healthcare providers noted that protective equipment usage increased following advisory updates. Despite increased usage, symptom persistence was documented in a subset of cases. Medical assessments indicate that while protective measures mitigate severity, they do not fully prevent exposure-related effects under current conditions. No exposure duration has been classified as fully safe at this time. Health agencies emphasized that advisories are based on risk reduction rather than risk elimination. Monitoring of symptom trends and clinical outcomes remains ongoing, and guidance may be revised as additional data becomes available. In parallel with public health concerns, damage assessments have confirmed significant impacts to historic landmarks and cultural assets. Stone surfaces across multiple sites exhibited etching patterns exceeding documented preservation records. These patterns include surface roughening, loss of fine detail, and accelerated material loss inconsistent with normal weathering processes. Concrete structures associated with heritage sites showed signs of internal fracturing. Non-destructive testing identified microcracking beneath surface layers, suggesting chemical or environmental penetration beyond exterior coatings. In several cases, structural integrity assessments were initiated despite no prior indications of vulnerability. Metal fixtures, including load-bearing anchors, ornamental supports, and reinforcement elements, exhibited corrosion at critical points. Corrosion progression was observed at joints and interfaces where moisture retention and material stress converge. Engineers reported that some fixtures reached degradation thresholds requiring stabilization to prevent further loss. Restoration teams documented damage progression through photographic records, material sampling, and comparative analysis with prior conservation data. In multiple cases, degradation advanced despite protective coverings or temporary barriers. Reversibility of the observed damage has not been confirmed. Conservation specialists emphasized that some impacts may exceed established restoration methodologies. Surface loss on stone elements and internal fracturing within concrete limit, available remediation options. Long-term preservation outcomes remain uncertain pending further evaluation. Cultural preservation agencies submitted requests for protective exemptions, including expanded access controls, enhanced barrier installation, and prioritized resource allocation. These requests are currently under assessment by regulatory and oversight bodies. No exemptions have been formally granted at this stage. Coordination between health agencies, cultural preservation authorities, and infrastructure operators remains active. Summary findings are being exchanged, though integration of data across sectors remains incomplete. No consolidated preservation directive has been issued. Officials confirmed that no affected landmark has returned to a pre-exposure condition and following initial impact. Stabilization efforts continue, but restoration benchmarks have not been met. Several sites remain under restricted access due to safety and preservation concerns. Public messaging regarding cultural assets emphasizes documentation, stabilization, and risk mitigation. Long-term restoration planning has not yet been finalized. Funding considerations, material availability, and technical feasibility remain under review. Health agencies reiterated that current advisories reflect ongoing conditions rather than a transition phase. Monitoring of exposure effects, compliance patterns, and clinical outcomes continues. No timeline for advisory expiration has been established. Authorities emphasized that the absence of emergency enforcement measures does not indicate reduced risk. It reflects jurisdictional variation in implementation and assessment thresholds. Engineering, medical, and preservation reviews remain active. Exposure impacts persist. Damage progression continues. Healthcare monitoring agencies have reported an increase in respiratory-related admissions across multiple regions. The rise has been observed across urban, suburban, and select rural healthcare systems. Admissions include cases presenting with shortness of breath, airway irritation, persistent coughing, and reduced oxygen saturation. Clinical reports confirm that cases were recorded despite adherence to indoor sheltering advisories. Hospitals noted that a portion of affected individuals had limited or no recent outdoor exposure. In these cases, symptom onset occurred while individuals remained indoors for extended periods. Investigations into indoor air quality and building envelope performance are ongoing. No single structural or environmental variable has been isolated as a determining factor. Air filtration systems installed in residential, commercial, and institutional buildings captured increased volumes of particulate matter. Analysis of collected material indicates particle sizes spanning multiple filtration thresholds. In addition to particulates, vaporized compounds were detected within sealed environments, indicating penetration beyond standard filtration and containment measures. Facilities reported that high-efficiency particulate filters reached saturation more rapidly than projected. Filtration replacement cycles were shortened in response, with some systems requiring replacement at intervals significantly below manufacturer recommendations. Despite increased replacement frequency, indoor air quality metrics did not consistently return to baseline. Building operators noted that sealed environments did not perform uniformly. Some structures maintained partial containment, while others exhibited measurable infiltration. Engineers reported that pressure differentials, material aging, and ventilation system configurations may contribute to variability. No standardized mitigation protocol has been validated. Hospitals activated surge protocols as admission rates increased. Emergency departments expanded triage capacity, and inpatient units adjusted staffing models to accommodate respiratory cases. Capacity thresholds were approached in several facilities, prompting coordination with regional health networks to manage patient flow. Elective procedures were deferred in some hospitals to preserve staffing and equipment availability. Portable respiratory support equipment was redistributed within networks where feasible. Administrators reported that while surge protocols improved short-term responsiveness, sustained demand continues to strain operational margins. Epidemiological review of reported cases did not confirm a correlation between shelter duration and symptom severity. Some patients with extended indoor sheltering reported moderate to severe symptoms, while others with limited exposure reported mild effects. Health agencies emphasized that current data does not support a defined safe exposure window. Parallel to healthcare developments, transportation authorities initiated selective shutdowns across affected regions. Decisions were based on exposure risk assessments, infrastructure vulnerability, and personnel safety considerations. Measures were applied incrementally rather than system-wide. Rail corridors were suspended in zones where exposure levels exceeded operational thresholds. Freight and passenger services were halted on specific segments following joint review by transportation and safety officials. Suspension durations were not standardized and remain subject to ongoing reassessment. Road access was restricted in affected areas through a combination of checkpoints, access permits, and temporary closures. Restrictions were applied selectively to limit non-essential movement while maintaining access for emergency services, utility crews, and supply transport. Enforcement approaches varied by jurisdiction. Aviation routes were recalculated to minimize exposure risk to crews and passengers. Flight paths were adjusted to avoid affected airspace where possible. In some cases, departures and arrivals were consolidated or delayed. Aviation authorities reported that air traffic remained functional but less flexible. Logistics chains responded with incremental rerouting. Distribution centers adjusted intake and dispatch schedules to accommodate transportation disruptions. Alternate corridors were utilized where available. These adjustments introduced compounding delays across supply networks. Freight operators reported increased transit times, inventory holding adjustments, and scheduling uncertainty. Perishable goods, medical supplies, and industrial inputs were prioritized where capacity allowed. Despite prioritization, delays accumulated across multiple sectors. Public advisories issued during this period referenced safety assessments conducted by health, environmental, and transportation agencies. Advisories emphasized compliance with restrictions and adherence to updated guidance. However, the criteria used to determine exposure thresholds and shutdown decisions were not published. Officials stated that assessment methodologies involve multiple variables, including environmental monitoring, infrastructure tolerance, and health indicators. Agencies cited the evolving nature of the data as the reason for limited disclosure. No consolidated assessment framework has been released. No comprehensive shutdown timetable was announced. Authorities indicated that decisions would continue to be made on a rolling basis as conditions evolve. Timelines for resumption of suspended services were not specified. Coordination between healthcare systems, transportation authorities, and logistics operators remains active. Information exchange continues through established channels, though integration of data sets remains incomplete. No unified operational command has been established. Public messaging emphasized monitoring, compliance, and preparedness for further adjustments. Advisories did not include expiration dates. Officials reiterated that guidance may change without advance notice as conditions are reassessed. Healthcare agencies confirmed that surveillance of respiratory cases continues. Transportation authorities confirmed that additional corridors may be reviewed for restriction. Logistics operators confirmed that contingency routing remains in effect. At this time, systems remain operational under constrained conditions. Healthcare capacity is managed but pressured. Transportation networks are partially suspended. Logistics flows continue with delay. No correlation between shelter duration and symptom severity has been validated. No sealed environment has been confirmed fully resistant. No comprehensive shutdown schedule has been issued. Further updates will be released as validation thresholds are revised and assessments are completed. Environmental monitoring teams have confirmed that rainwater runoff from urban and industrial zones has entered riverine and coastal systems across multiple regions. Field inspections and water quality sampling indicate that runoff volumes exceed historical averages and contaminant loads remain elevated. Observations have been corroborated by satellite imagery, remote sensing, and in situ testing stations. Downstream from urban zones, significant fish die-offs have been recorded. Multiple species, including both freshwater and estuarine populations, have exhibited acute mortality. Mortality patterns suggest rapid onset and widespread exposure rather than isolated incidents. Sampling confirms elevated levels of chemical compounds, suspended particulates, and dissolved pollutants. In several areas, decomposition has contributed to localized oxygen depletion, further exacerbating ecosystem stress. Ecosystem monitoring indicates a rapid decline in both biological and environmental indicators. Aquatic vegetation has exhibited bleaching and dieback. Invertebrate populations have decreased significantly, and key indicator species are absent from sampling plots. Laboratory analyses confirm elevated levels of nitrates, phosphates, and other industrial byproducts exceeding recommended ecological thresholds. Containment strategies have been reviewed at municipal, regional, and national levels. Measures include temporary barriers, sediment traps, diversion channels, and emergency response deployments. While planning and review have occurred, actual deployment of containment strategies has remained limited. Factors affecting deployment include equipment availability, personnel constraints, and the scale of contamination, which extends across multiple catchment areas simultaneously. Water quality measurements continue to exceed established thresholds. Key parameters, including turbidity, dissolved oxygen, pH, heavy metal concentrations, and biological oxygen demand, have remained outside regulatory limits. Continuous monitoring shows repeated excursions beyond safe levels, indicating that contamination persists and is not currently being mitigated effectively. Regulatory authorities are evaluating the reclassification of affected waterways to reflect current ecological and human health risks. This process includes consultation with environmental agencies, fisheries authorities, and public health organizations. No recovery markers have been detected in monitored ecosystems. Species that typically indicate ecosystem stabilization or natural regeneration remain absent. Riparian and estuarine habitats continue to show signs of structural and functional decline. Sediment profiles indicate ongoing contamination and disruption of microbial communities. This lack of recovery occurs alongside broader systemic pressures from climate variability, continued precipitation events, and urban runoff. Agricultural output in affected regions has not stabilized. Crop losses from prolonged saturation, nutrient leaching, and soil degradation remain substantial. Soil pH and buffering capacity are compromised, further limiting the potential for immediate recovery. Replanting strategies are under review, but remain tentative pending environmental stabilization. Material resistance across infrastructure systems continues to decline. Protective coatings on equipment, structural reinforcements, and storage facilities are failing earlier than projected. Reapplication schedules and maintenance cycles have been insufficient to restore original performance. Degradation has accelerated under continued environmental stress, including high moisture, runoff exposure, and chemical contact. Power infrastructure remains degraded. Substations, transmission lines, and load-bearing components continue to operate below design tolerances. Corrosion and mechanical wear are persistent, despite ongoing maintenance efforts. Load balancing and operational adjustments have been implemented to maintain service continuity, yet no grid sector has returned to pre-degradation conditions. Public exposure advisories remain active. Health agencies continue to recommend restricted outdoor movement in affected areas and the use of protective measures for essential activity. Compliance is variable, and protective equipment mitigates but does not eliminate exposure. No duration of outdoor activity has been classified as fully safe under current conditions. Transportation reductions continue. Rail corridors remain partially suspended. Road access is restricted in high-risk zones, and aviation routes have been recalculated to minimize exposure to environmental hazards. Logistics chains have been rerouted incrementally, resulting in accumulated delays. A comprehensive shutdown timetable has not been issued, and authorities continue to evaluate corridor-specific risk thresholds on a rolling basis. Environmental systems overall show ongoing collapse. Aquatic and terrestrial habitats remain stressed, chemical contamination persists, and ecosystem functionality continues to deteriorate. Natural buffers, such as wetlands and riparian zones, have been compromised, further limiting resilience. Monitoring indicates no system is currently exhibiting recovery trends. No system, ecological, agricultural, industrial, or infrastructural, has reverted to a previous operational state. Degradation persists across multiple domains, and temporary interventions are insufficient to restore pre-event conditions. Authorities continue to track environmental, public health, agricultural, and infrastructure indicators. Continuous monitoring, assessment, and data consolidation are ongoing. Coordination between environmental agencies, health authorities, transportation operators, and infrastructure managers remains active, but has not yielded comprehensive recovery measures. Further updates will be issued as validation thresholds are revised, monitoring data are confirmed, and mitigation strategies are deployed. Current conditions indicate continuation of systemic degradation across all monitored sectors. Emergency supplies stored across multiple facilities continue to deteriorate. Reports from regional logistics teams indicate that packaging breakdown has been confirmed across essential inventories, including food, medicine, and operational equipment. Observed failures include swelling of containers, compromised seals, leaks in food storage units, and partial collapse of packaging designed for long-term storage. In medical supplies, packaging failure has resulted in reduced shelf life and increased sensitivity to environmental exposure. Equipment stored in racks exhibits surface corrosion, mechanical degradation, and compromised functionality in some instances. Inspection logs confirm that deterioration is ongoing across multiple storage sites, with no regions currently exempt from observed degradation. Losses remain active, and replacement schedules are under review. Procurement authorities are evaluating current stock levels, warehouse capacities, and supply chain constraints to determine priorities. Redistribution plans, which would direct supplies from less affected facilities to those experiencing the greatest degradation, have not been finalized. As a result, certain regional inventories may remain vulnerable while the evaluation process continues. Construction standards have been quietly revised mid-crisis. New guidelines acknowledge that previously established safety margins were insufficient given current environmental stressors, material performance, and operational conditions. Structural load limits have been adjusted downward in recognition of accelerated wear observed in recently constructed elements. Materials previously rated for extended exposure, such as steel coatings, treated timber, and protective sealants, are exhibiting accelerated deterioration under repeated precipitation, humidity, and chemical exposure. Implementation schedules for the revised standards remain provisional, reflecting both the scale of existing construction projects and resource availability. Compliance assessments are ongoing, but remain incomplete. Engineering teams continue to document deviations from both prior and revised specifications, and no structure has returned to pre-crisis design or safety parameters. Public messaging has shifted in response to these developments. Officials now reference adaptation as a primary strategy rather than temporary protection. Guidance emphasizes ongoing risk awareness, adherence to operational safety measures, and preparation for extended exposure conditions. Long-term behavioral recommendations are under evaluation, including strategies for shelter management, resource rationing, and operational continuity. No endpoint for the current event has been established, and authorities caution that the situation remains dynamic. Inspection of storage facilities continues on a rolling basis. Food storage units have been documented with swelling, leakage, and compromised sealing. Refrigeration and humidity control systems, where installed, have failed to maintain ideal storage conditions in several instances, contributing to accelerated spoilage. Medical supplies show compromised packaging, including blister packs, vials, and sterile containers, with deterioration impacting both usability and shelf life. Equipment stored on racks exhibits surface corrosion, mechanical binding, and in some cases, misalignment of movable components. Field inspections have documented these issues across multiple regional facilities, and deterioration continues despite routine monitoring. Buildings under construction are being evaluated under revised standards. Structural load limits have been recalculated, and materials subjected to accelerated exposure are being monitored closely. Field teams report that coating failures, microfractures, and material fatigue are occurring more rapidly than previously modeled. Engineering reviews remain active, but completion of revised evaluations is pending due to the number of projects, resource constraints, and ongoing environmental pressures. No structure under construction has returned to pre-crisis design specifications, and in some cases, newly applied materials are already showing signs of accelerated degradation. Evacuation shelters continue to operate under persistent stress. Roof panels and support elements are showing signs of wear, sealants are failing, and ventilation systems are compromised. Microfractures have been observed in load-bearing components, including beams and trusses, raising concerns about long-term structural integrity. Repairs are delayed or incomplete due to resource constraints, personnel limitations, and competing priorities across affected regions. Shelter operators report continued occupancy at or near capacity, which exacerbates wear and limits the ability to perform comprehensive maintenance. Temporary reinforcement measures have been implemented in some facilities, including supplemental bracing, redistributed load management, and localized ceiling repairs. While these actions provide limited mitigation, they are insufficient to restore full operational or structural capacity. Maintenance and inspection logs indicate that temporary measures accumulate over time without achieving baseline stability. Coordination between logistics operators, engineering teams, and public authorities remains ongoing. Summary reports are compiled and shared at regional and national levels. However, data integration is incomplete, and no consolidated remediation or recovery plan has been issued. Resource allocation continues to be prioritized based on immediate operational risk, leaving longer-term structural and inventory stabilization pending. Health and safety monitoring continues in occupied spaces. Exposure advisories have been issued for personnel handling compromised supplies, including recommended protective equipment, handling protocols, and decontamination procedures. Compliance varies across facilities, and protective measures reduce but do not fully eliminate risk during prolonged operational activity. At this time, no storage facility, building under construction, or occupied shelter has returned to pre-crisis operational or structural status. Degradation remains ongoing across multiple sectors. Temporary interventions have stabilized immediate hazards, but do not reverse underlying material or logistical decline. Authorities emphasize that the absence of catastrophic failure in current operations does not indicate recovery. All monitored systems remain under stress, and continuation of the event is confirmed. Further updates will be issued as assessment thresholds are revised, resource allocations are finalized, and validation of mitigation measures is completed. Monitoring, inspection, and operational management continue on an active basis. Acid fog events have been reported across multiple urban regions, occurring even during periods without rainfall. Observers report the sudden formation of low-visibility chemical mists, often appearing without warning. Monitoring stations confirm that particulate concentrations in affected areas remain elevated above baseline levels. These conditions have been recorded in both central and peripheral urban zones, with no consistent pattern of occurrence. Protective measures, including sheltering and barriers, remain advisory. No structure, shelter, or environmental control has demonstrated full mitigation against these mists. Public advisories emphasize adaptation rather than temporary protection. Outdoor activity is restricted to essential tasks only, and officials caution that even brief exposure carries risk. Protective clothing, respiratory barriers, and other recommended equipment reduce contact with hazardous particulate matter, but they do not eliminate exposure entirely. Health authorities continue to track symptoms associated with environmental contact, including respiratory irritation, eye discomfort, and skin inflammation. Long-term effects of sustained exposure remain unknown, and data regarding prolonged contact at current concentrations are not available. Transportation and access routes have been adjusted in response to hazard assessments. Certain corridors, including rail, road, and pedestrian pathways, are restricted based on exposure risk. Emergency and essential services continue to operate, but only under limited access protocols. Secondary and auxiliary routes remain under continuous assessment to ensure that alternative pathways are available if primary corridors are compromised. At this time, no comprehensive operational status of transportation networks has been released. Emergency supply management continues under pressure. Stockpiles of food, medical provisions, and equipment remain active, but inventory integrity is partially compromised. Packaging failure is ongoing, contributing to gradual accumulation of losses. Replacement cycles are incomplete, and redistribution plans have not been fully implemented. No mitigation timeline for supply stabilization has been confirmed. Construction and structural monitoring confirm continued stress under revised safety standards. Buildings, shelters, and critical infrastructure are being evaluated on a rolling basis. Material degradation persists despite updated guidelines. Roofs, supports, sealants, and load-bearing components show progressive wear, and inspection cycles repeatedly confirm increasing vulnerability. Structural stress appears accelerated by both environmental exposure and operational load, and no structure has returned to pre-event specifications. Acid fog events continue to recur unpredictably. Sensor networks report repeated low visibility conditions, elevated chemical concentrations, and fluctuating particulate levels. Temporary protective measures, including sealed shelters, filtration units, and protective coatings, remain partially effective, but no system has fully restored environmental conditions to baseline. Medical authorities report that the long-term effects of exposure remain unquantified. Continuous monitoring and symptom tracking are underway, but there is no precedent or data set for sustained contact at the current scale. Health outcomes, particularly cumulative effects on respiratory and ocular systems, remain uncertain. Evacuation shelters continue to operate under persistent environmental stress. Food, medical supplies, and equipment stored in these facilities continue to experience degradation. Losses from packaging failure, contamination, and mechanical wear are accumulating. Public advisories emphasize adaptation, including rationing, protective measures, and ongoing operational awareness. Across all monitored systems, no network has returned to prior operational stability. Infrastructure, emergency supply chains, construction projects, and environmental conditions continue to advance under continuous stress. Temporary measures provide mitigation, but do not reverse degradation or restore baseline performance. Authorities emphasize that monitoring, evaluation, and operational adjustments are ongoing. Updates will be issued when validation thresholds are revised or when new mitigation strategies are confirmed. Until that time, continued adaptation, restricted activity, and protective measures remain the recommended course of action. No system has returned to baseline conditions. All networks continue under active stress. All monitored sectors remain in a state of managed degradation. End of transmission.